Hi, welcome to our second video on Sonkeigo. Last time we covered the words meshiagaru, goran ni naru, gozonji, and oide ni naru, in addition to talking about what Sonkeigo is and when it is used. Only for others it's important to remember. If you're unclear about any of that, or you simply need a refresher on the meanings and usages of the words or on Sonkeigo itself, go take another look at the last video before continuing with this one. In this video, I will cover 4 Sonkeigo verbs that are extremely common, and 3 of which I would bet are not entirely unfamiliar to you. These 4 verbs, however, are among the few verbs in Japanese to have irregular conjugation, so they do require some special attention beyond just memorizing their use in phrases. So we're going to start with nasaru, which is going to replace suru when you want to express respect towards whoever is suruing, right? So remember, we use Sonkeigo when speaking about others to whom we wish to show respect. That's important. Chances are you already know this word. It's in the phrase oyasumi nasai, which is the functional equivalent to the English expression, of course, good night. Take a second to think about what it actually means, though. We know that yasumi means rest, and o is just an honorific prefix, so your honorable rest or something like that. When it comes to nasai, we begin to see the irregularity in the conjunction I talked about, and the conjugation that I talked about earlier. If we think about suru becoming shimasu, we see what's happening when nasaru becomes nasaimasu. In other words, when we want to add mas to nasaru, we have to take off that final ru and replace it with an i. So nasaru becomes nasaimasu, nasaimashita, nasaimasen, etc. Going back to oyasumi nasai, however, we can see this conjugation. On its own, it's actually acting as a command form here, but a polite one, since nasaru is actually a Sonkeigo verb. Thus, this would mean literally something along the lines of please rest. Note, though, that the sense of politeness is now slightly archaic. When nasai is used these days, it is a slightly rude way of telling somebody to do something, and is usually directed towards children because of that. It's really not very rare to hear a Japanese mother tell her children to tabe nasai, or something along those lines. Generally, though, it's probably a good idea to steer clear of its use outside these sorts of fixed expressions like oyasumi nasai, but it's still helpful to know what it's doing if you do encounter it. So now that we've looked at that irregular conjugation of nasaru, let's look at a little how it's actually used. Remember, it's going to replace suru. So we have Kachou wa 2時から食事をなさいます. This is a really simple sentence, but if it's not clicking for you, try replacing that nasaimasu with shimasu. When we do that, it's pretty simple to see that this sentence means the section chief will eat, or literally do eating, at 2 o'clock. Lucky for you, the other 3 verbs we're going to cover in this video conjugate the same way as nasaru. To recap, we're going to take off that final ru and replace it with i before adding mas. The first of these is irasharu, a fossilized form of which you know from the phrase irashaimase, which anybody who's gone to a konbini or other store or restaurant in Japan is going to know quite well. Irasharu is going to replace iru, iku, or kuru, and is thus used similarly to oide ni naru from the last video. Let's start with the same sentence frame from the last video. 先週、先生が私の家にいらっしゃいました. Remember this sentence? We discussed it being slightly ambiguous, but decided that kuru is probably the closest meaning of the verb. The same interpretation is going to work here as well. The sentence thus means, last week, my teacher came to my house. Let's look at another very common usage. すみません、夏目さんはいらっしゃいますか? Imagine walking up to a house, knocking on the door, and asking this question. Would it make sense to translate irasharu as iku or kuru? Since the verb is in the present tense, not really. And so it's pretty safe to assume this sentence is going to mean, excuse me, but is Mr. Natsume in? Is he here? Iru? So essentially, irashaimasu ka? Imasu ka? Not too hard. Our next verb we're going to talk about is osharu, which replaces verbs related to speaking, specifically yu, hanasu, and tsugeru. For example, 店長は社長の報告についておっしゃいました. From について, we can tell that the verb which would make the most sense here is probably hanasu, meaning that we can translate this sentence as the the branch manager talked about the company president's report. One more. 課長は田中さんにリストラの予定をおっしゃいました. This time, any of the translations here are going to work just as well to express that the section chief told Mr. Tanaka about the company's restructuring plans. Talk to Mr. Tanaka about would also be an accurate translation. The last verb we're going to discuss in this video is one you probably use almost every time you speak polite Japanese and you don't even know it. Kudasaru, which you probably know from in its imperative form from the phrase kudasai, which means please, is unsurprisingly a replacement of kureru. This means when you say kudasai, you're really saying something like give me or do something for me. Kudasaru, like kureru, is often used on its own, but perhaps more commonly in conjunction with other verbs to express that sense of somebody doing something for you. Let's take a look at one example of each of those. So our first is going to be Sensei wa ii seiseki o kudasaimashita. So kudasaru has the same implications as kureru, meaning that whatever was kudasatta benefits the speaker in some way, and not just in the physical sense of receiving something. Therefore, this sense is easily translatable as the teacher gave me a good grade. Now let's look at kudasaru when it's preceded by another verb. So we have here, 課長は上司のことをおっしゃってくださるために私の自宅までいらっしゃいました. In this sentence, we see kudasaru preceded by osharu, which we just covered earlier in the lesson. Putting everything we've covered together, what do you think this sentence might mean? I suggest taking a minute to think about it if you're not quite sure, because it's really going to be helpful if you could figure this out on your own. Hopefully, you were able to understand the sentence as equivalent to the section chief came to my house to tell me of my promotion. So in this video, we've covered 4 common Sonkeigo verbs, nasaru, irasharu, osharu, and kudasaru, and their irregular conjugations, such as nasaimasu, irashaimasu, oshaimasu, and kudasaimasu. We also began to put these verbs together and get a feel for how the usage of Sonkeigo can completely transform a sentence, even a simple one. In the next video, we'll cover the next type of Keigo, Kenjogo, which instead of elevating whomever it is being spoken to or of, actually humbles the speaker. See you then. 今回もよろしくお願いいたします。